Right, so we're starting the live stream here. Okay, all right, I'm gonna do this, and all right, I'm gonna hit live, and here we go. Our guests are starting to enter here. Okay. I'm going to close this YouTube live stream window so I don't have to stare at myself twice, which is very strange.
I don't know if I'd like that very much.
No.
Double vision usually comes later in the evening, I guess, right?
Yeah. Okay. Here we go. We have some guests pouring in, and oh,
sorry.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Are we all set? Am I doing the echo thing again, or are we good?
No, we're all set.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. This is our newest episode of Drinking with Historians right now, and ooh, I am getting a lot of feedback for some reason that I don't really understand. But anyway, here we are. It's going to be a little bit distracting, but that's okay. So thank you so much for joining us. This episode of Drinking with Historians, we're actually, let me mute myself. Varsha, do you want to take over for a sec while I try to figure this out?
1 sec. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. I really appreciate it. So what we're doing today is we're partnering with Uncle Nearest and the Uncle Nearest Initiative to sort of tell the story about African Americans and how they have been taken away from the story of distilling, specifically in the history of whiskey, but also in the history of rum. So with us, we have Tracy Franklin, who is a master distiller with the Uncle Nearest and Nearest.
Do you want me to say it's a whole mouthful? So yeah. I'm a master distiller apprentice in the Nearest and Jack Advancement Initiative. It is an initiative that Jack Daniels and Uncle Nearest have come together to create to increase diversity in the leadership positions and in the world of whiskey.
Nice. And she is on her way to become a master distiller, which is very, very amazing because there are very few female master distillers. So I'm really excited. Our second guest is Steve Bayshore, who is a distiller from Mount Vernon. He also got a degree in history from the University of Texas, and then he made his way all the way to Mount Vernon. And then our final guest is a historian of rum, who's also worked at Mount Vernon, Jordan Smith at Widener University. He's an assistant professor who works on the history of rum, specifically looking at how the invention, commodification, and invention of rum creates or involves the history of enslaved people. I'm so sorry, there's a feedback in my ears, so I apologize. But before we get going, I just wanted to ask everybody, I am having a glass of Uncle Nearest 1856. What is everybody else drinking? Tracy, are you also having Uncle Nearest?
Yes, I'm going to pour the same.
Nice. Jordan, what are you having?
I am representing Philadelphia, where I'm zooming from, so I have a Negroni tonight.
Excellent.
And some Uncle Nearest to try as well.
Wonderful.
And Steve?
I do have my sample of Uncle Nearest here as well, but also some Stoll and Wolf from Lidditz, PA. And this is the single cask that was done in honor of Dick Stoll, who passed away not too long ago.
Yeah. And Matt, you're also drinking Uncle Nearest, correct?
I am. I have my bottle of Uncle Nearest 1856. As we were joking about earlier, is that, as opposed to switching or drinking water in the tried and true Drinking with Historians tradition, we're just going to drink whiskey for an hour. So we'll see how far down that bottle goes over the course.
I love it.
So I guess, yeah, my first question, I got into whiskey a while ago, specifically as the result of winning a bet. Before that, I was not a whiskey person. So I guess my question is, Steve and Jordan and Tracy, how did you all get into whiskey, and how is whiskey made? Anybody can take that question.
So I got into whiskey because I was actually touring nationally and internationally with Broadway shows. And as a singer, alcohol affects my voice. So I couldn't drink a lot but I could drink things that were really super powerful and flavorful and like just have one and sit in the corner and just slowly sip it. And whiskey became that thing. So I really sort of started exploring that world, fell in love, and then realized there was so much to learn, because what you're doing is taking a grain, and there are so many different types of grains, but you are fermenting that and then distilling it, maturing it. And throughout that entire process, there's so many choices that can be made that can affect the flavor of the whiskey. So that process is still being done today, but I'm going to pass on the technical aspects to Steve Bayshore.
We do have to, at some point, come back to you saying that you were touring with Broadway shows, because I need to hear more about that. But please, Steve, go ahead.
Well, just to make it real basic, is whiskey is developed off, as Tracy said, the fermentation of various grains, which first have to be milled and then cooked and fermented, and malted barley is a key component to that as you convert starch to sugar. And then you add your yeast and let that fermentation go active and work for a period of days. From there, it's moved to a still. And in all the early periods, they were big copper pots and they were wood fired. Of course, equipment today is much different across the board, whether it be rum or whatever's being made. But over the centuries, it was pot stills, and those were batch distillations, which you had to do pass one and then come back, drain the still and do the second pass or the third pass. And of course, in the early period, a lot of it was not aged. That comes in the 19th century, but that is a little different for brandies and certain things on the continent of Europe where they did age. So yeah, it's basically grain based, and you move through that process to get your spirit made.
Great. So, sorry, I was just going to ask a follow-up, Jordan. I don't mean to interrupt you. Is that so? So was that? I mean, the focus of the conversation today, right, is about kind of the history of distilling, but especially the role of Black Americans, enslaved Americans, in that. So in the early Republic, in the early Americas, was whiskey kind of a favorite type of drink, or were there other kind of distilled spirits that were much more popular? And I guess that question's more for Jordan than the others for right now. So.
Sure. Yeah, I was gonna jump in with the how I got into whiskey, and it had a lot to do with Steve. I had the greatest job my last summer before I graduated from college, and then after college, where I was in part working at the distillery, and that's kind of factored into the way in which I think about kind of alcohol, the history of alcohol production. So in early America, the kind of major kind of spirit that was going to be consumed was rum. And so a lot of what Steve talked about with kind of the distillation process was basically identical. Rum usually used larger stills, but otherwise it was pretty similar. But the difference between rum and kind of whiskey is that rum is being made from the waste products of sugar. So when we think about kind of alcohol production in early America, when we think about kind of American colonization, there were 13 colonies in North America, well, actually more than 13 in North America, but then almost as many in the Caribbean, where those were kind of sugar societies producing hundreds of thousands to millions of gallons of rum or of molasses, which was often being moved to North America and turned into rum, or also sometimes made into rum in the Caribbean. And so that was the sort of beverage that everybody was going to be consuming, kind of in kind of large quantities. With kind of whiskeys, and especially kind of corn-based whiskey, was really an invention of the latter half of the 18th century, and really kind of picked up steam, I'd say, around kind of 1790 or so. But rum was, again, we found that in any tavern you went to, many private homes, and there were distilleries actually in all 13 colonies.
Do you mind if I actually had a question on this, Jordan? Because as I was kind of doing some research, I was trying to do a little bit, so I didn't look completely inept on this call. I'm not one of the experts, but one of the things that was, or that people weren't quite sure about, was the start of rum. So whether that was something that actually slaves had because molasses was being thrown away, and that they were the ones that actually discovered. So I'll let you take it. You're nodding.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge part of kind of what I'm trying to accomplish in my book. And something that's motivated the last decade of my research, which was trying to kind of track down the invention of rum, and kind of recognizing the different groups of people who would have had access to ingredients, the knowledge and the equipment necessary to make rum. And so, I think I entered kind of this whole process thinking that I wanted to kind of prove that rum was the invention of either Native American or African American bondspeople in the Caribbean. And I think the story that ultimately has kind of shown itself is a little bit more complicated and more interesting than that. And that is that rum required the confluence of different knowledge cultures, kind of first in Barbados in the mid 17th century, but then in other Caribbean colonies and eventually North America. And so that is kind of equipment, kind of stills kind of brought from Europe. It is kind of fermentation techniques, often kind of carried or kind of at least kind of possessed by African descended people. It involved kind of the labor of African and indigenous people. And then of course it involved individuals on the ground adapting to their surroundings. And that was a variety of different groups of people that were all necessary for kind of the invention of this new commodity around 1640.
So I guess my question builds on that. So when it comes to the export of rum and then eventually a whiskey, do the North American colonies and then the United States become one of the major exporters? And what role do African Americans play in that export process?
Sure. So there were, so a lot of rum is kind of passing through North America. So again, some rum would have been made in the Caribbean, would have been consumed in the Caribbean, consumed in Europe, consumed to a certain extent in Africa as part of the transatlantic slave trade. But North America, I think by 1770 was producing somewhere around 4.8 million gallons of rum per year. And so there were about 140 distilleries in North America at that time. Again, in all 13 colonies, as well as certain kind of colonies that would eventually become part of Canada. And they, some of these stills, and this is something that I think Steve and Tracy can kind of speak to. Some of these stills were really large, maybe 2,500 gallon stills, sometimes even larger. But so again, the rum industry in North America was kind of a key node in the triangle trade with kind of West Africa. And so sometimes molasses was being kind of extracted from the Caribbean, turned into rum in North America, sent back to West Africa, where kind of more people were purchased with that rum. And so it was this kind of really kind of tragic cycle of human exploitation. Again, in those distilleries, and certainly in the Caribbean, but also in North America, enslaved distillers and enslaved distillery workers of other sorts were a huge part of the work being done, and kind of the innovations that kind of characterized the industry throughout the 17th and 18th centuries.
Yeah, I have a question for Steve. When it comes to trying to find the voices of enslaved African Americans who worked in these distilleries, how do you go about doing that at Mount Vernon?
Well, we're fortunate that the records at Mount Vernon are voluminous, and that includes slave lists and even in the letters and the farm reports and other, if you read deep enough, you can even see stories and anecdotes about the enslaved community and various people that lived and worked at Mount Vernon, both stories that are unique and interesting and stories that are tragic as well and painful to read. At the distillery at Mount Vernon in the late 1790s, there were 6 young enslaved men that were listed as at the distillery. And we don't know a lot of details about them other than they worked there. We also know about the millers. There was always paid staff there, but there was a man named Ben who was listed as a miller from about 1784 till the end of Washington's life. And there is a letter that Washington comments to another business associate. He says that Ben, who knows the milling business very well. So I take that, I can read beyond that and think that Ben probably could read and write a little bit. Ben probably could do mathematics, because when the grain came from the different farms to the mill, that had to be recorded in a ledger because it was tracked by what farm brought how many bushels of whatever grain to the mill. So by reading history that way, you have to sometimes connect dots like a detective. And I forgot to mention how I came to whiskey is really through grain milling. I've been running water mills now, it's hard to believe, for 27 years. And so I've been a miller for many years and came to Mount Vernon as the distillery was being restored. But through this, the study of the records gives us stories and highlights the humanity of the people that lived and worked there. And sometimes you can't find a lot about certain folks, but we do have a pretty good breakdown of who lived on each farm at Mount Vernon, some of their familial relationships and children we know. And there are stories amongst that reading that tells you something of the lives that they lived on the estate.
So I think that's one of the things I think that we love to talk about here is and one of the things our audience likes is the types of sources. I mean, the way that historians, the way that people who study the past kind of do their work, right? And I think what's really fascinating about this particular topic is we're not just dealing with texts, which historians are kind of very typically associated with, but we're dealing with material culture, right? Material remains like archaeology and you know,
Well,
the kind of stuff of history as well.
That's a great point. If I could make a point that ties into that.
Please,
is, in the 1980s, when Mount Vernon started its archaeological program, which was founded by Dennis Pogue, who later on went to do our preservation department, they had to do utility work on the North Lane between the blacksmith shop and the greenhouse. And in the early part of Mount Vernon history, there was a slave house there called the House for Families that was 2.5 stories high. There's a painting of it that exists from 1792 because Washington built barracks on the greenhouse, ends up tearing down the House for Families. But there's a snapshot in time when the House for Families is still standing, and it's in this painting. So you can see the new barracks, the House for Families. Well, they had to dig for these utilities. So archaeology goes in first to see if we're going to disturb anything. And they found the cellar to the House for Families, which was a gold mine of, I think, over 75,000 artifacts, something crazy like that. That included, it basically went from being a cellar to somewhat of a trash pit. So food, items that were personal, all these things were in there, and they excavated all that over a period of years in 2 digs. And that fills in more of the story of the lives of the folks that lived there. So the combination of documentation, archaeology really helps tell as full a story as we can in many cases.
Is that the same case for when you're looking at Rum Jordan, or if you're looking at other distilleries across Northern America and even the Caribbean?
Yeah, I mean, so there has been some archaeological work. There was a big archaeological project at Mount Vernon, kind of cataloging their distillery before it was rebuilt. And there have been several, maybe 3 other North American distilleries that have been excavated. There's some archaeologists in the Caribbean working on Caribbean distilleries as well. So kind of material culture in that regard. I've looked at kind of the writings of, kind of the records created by still makers, for instance, where you see kind of how somebody described what they wanted, which oftentimes assumed all of this knowledge. So, you know, one of the things that I think Steve and I both have kind of worked with sometimes is trying to reconstruct from kind of this shorthand that people who were in the business knew what was going on. And so I think even sometimes experience can be a part of kind of reading sources like differently. And so I mentioned some of the ways in which kind of work that I conducted at Mount Vernon factored into how I thought about things. When we were distilling, and I think it's become, every time we distilled, different issues would come up. And, it wasn't that we didn't have people who had distilled before. We had sometimes read old guides to distillation. There were a lot of things that just weren't written down because they were the sort of knowledge that were going to be passed on through apprenticeship, through training. And it was just assumed that everybody would know those things. And so that's something that I think is really important too, to kind of try to get past kind of shorthand and figure out kind of how things were working. And sometimes that is aided by kind of trying it yourself.
Well, there was a lot of trial and error there, Jordan, wasn't there? And one of the things I recall after reading one of those texts from the 18th century was, and this was through our friend Mark Meltonville, who's the food historian for the Royal Palaces, and Mark's just a dang genius. And we read this text, and he pointed out, it said, you yeast 2 nights in a day. And if you didn't know that you set the yeast late the first night in the 18th century, you wouldn't understand what the phrases meant. Because you have to row all that mash, get the grains in, takes a long time. You don't have the ability to cool it. And so those little things, I think, is what Jordan's pointing out. By doing it, we figured okay, now I understand that text better. So occasionally we'll read that old text while we're distilling and going, yep, that's what we're doing right now.
Well, and I think the story I would always use in kind of job talks was just the amount of foam that we created. So if if grains were added at the wrong temperature, you would end up just your mash tubs would just kind of create this foam that would sometimes cover the floor. So we had a lot of time to think about what we did wrong as we were mopping up afterwards. So yeah, but again, those were things that probably weren't happening as often in the 18th century because sometimes people who couldn't read or write or were not kind of publishing these guides kind of carried that knowledge with them. And so again, one of the things I'm interested in thinking about is how they gained that information and how they might have passed it on.
Well, if I could ask too, I mean, one of the things that this kind of leads into is kind of the social life, or the social life of distilling, like of distilled spirits, I should say, in this particular period. Is like, so how did it kind of play in, either kind of in a specific instance of life at Mount Vernon in the late 18th, the late 18th century, or as kind of rum as a kind of cultural commodity? Is that like how did enslaved Americans kind of like, if they were producing it, were they consuming it? Was it mostly intended for sale? How was the plantation owners like how did this kind of work? What was the economy and kind of the social life around these spirits at this particular period?
Yeah, so everybody was drinking rum, and that's I think important to remember. And drinking more rum than we would think everybody should have been drinking rum in some ways. And so we see that in kind of rations of enslaved people in the Caribbean. The Code Noir, which governed or was supposed to govern kind of the relationship between kind of slaveholders and the enslaved in French possessions, actually dictated that it could not be kind of the rations in place of food. But even there, it would be used kind of in addition to the food rations. And I think that it could have kind of functioned as currency in many ways, but also as kind of a way to reward and to kind of work. And so even I think of George Washington bought rum, for instance, from a distillery in Alexandria, Virginia. And again, these farm records that Steve's talking about, there are dozens of records of individual enslaved people being given that rum. Again, we know where it was made. We know where the molasses came from. For everything from getting a cow out of a mire to kind of catching fish on a Sunday to kind of a woman in childbirth. It was part of mourning rituals. I think there are many stories from around the kind of Black Atlantic of kind of rum as a consumable, but also rum as something that would have been kind of poured on a grave, being used in those sorts of spiritual rituals. I think it was also kind of part of oath taking for maroon communities in the Caribbean. And so, it had many uses kind of within what plantation owners were seeing, and then things that they knew about but didn't really understand. So it was a huge part of kind of the social fabric of the Black Atlantic.
I guess I wanted to ask, when it comes to whiskey and the knowledge that it takes to produce this whiskey, when it comes to like looking at the records about Vernon, can you see not how much, but can you quantify to what degree Mount Vernon relied on enslaved people to produce their liquor, to produce their spirits? Is it more that they relied on enslaved people and the history hasn't really been told until recently? Or was it a collaborative effort, right?
Well, I think that they certainly relied on the 6 men in the distillery and the millers, in addition to the coopers. Tom, Moses, and Jacob were the coopers there right by the mill, making all those barrels for that whiskey to go into. Now, the whiskey wasn't aged, but it had to travel to market. And then you could also tie back in the agricultural of the fields, the African Americans who are growing the rye, the corn, the barley. And it's interesting, at Mount Vernon, most of the people that plowed fields were women, were enslaved women. So in fact, enslaved women outnumbered the men on each of the farms, whereas at the distillery and mill with the industry, the men outnumbered the women. Tracy, does that seem to be a theme that you probably deal with too in the industry?
I find that very interesting, actually, and I feel like that's going to be changing, right? Well, the question that I sort of had about this was, so I think that we are currently learning about how much of the work was actually being done by people of color, enslaved people of color, but was there something different within the rum industry that it seems, did it require less labor? Like, why is it that New England and sort of that area had less slaves and was able to kind of continue with their production, whereas it got even more prevalent, I feel, throughout as whiskey came along, which I think involves a bit more physical labor? Do you think that is part of it? Or I'm just curious how it works within the industry, what you think each industry relied upon slaves for?
Absolutely. So I think some of the point, I think this was a really important point Steve made, that, if we think about kind of whiskey, we have to think about agriculture alongside of that. And obviously what the base ingredient for sugar was kind of grown and processed somewhere, but that was kind of geographically removed from where most of these rum distilleries were. And so it changed the relationship to slavery in some ways as a result. But the largest slaveholders in North American cities, especially Philadelphia, New York, especially Boston and Newport and Providence, the largest slaveholders often were distillers. And so that's something that I think generally historians are focusing a little bit more on, kind of this slavery as a national institution. So that's something that I think we want to kind of keep in mind. I appreciate Steve's kind of using names, and I think that's such a powerful way for us to kind of recognize kind of these human stories. But for instance, Sharp and Tom were two kind of enslaved workers at a Philadelphia distillery in the 1760s. And I found kind of dozens of other names of distillers because it was kind of part of the fabric of North American cities.
Now
Yeah.
I'm a simple sorry, Steve. I'm a simple medieval historian here, so I don't understand anything about like after 1200 or something like that. But I have been reliably informed that the North didn't have anything to do with slavery, and it was really just the South. So, but you're telling me no, that's actually not true. And so I guess my question is kind of, after the dumb segue that I'm doing right now, is about like how widespread is distilling in the early Americas, right? Especially in North America. Like, is it something that is indeed kind of happening everywhere, or is it contained, mostly to large cities or to coastal areas, or to, as we might think about to, plantations like something like Mount Vernon or something like that?
But I think it's all over the place and at different levels. It patterns much what you see in Scotland in the 18th century, where you had the coastal large distilleries. You had the middle part of the country where it reached to maybe a regional market but couldn't export. And then you had the Highland distilleries that were up there hiding out, doing whatever they did by the light of the moon. And at America, in Virginia by 1810, there were 3,500 distilleries. Now, a lot of those are farm distilleries. To any farmer, a piece of copper like that's a good piece of equipment to have, because grain spoils, or you want to get something to market. You don't want to lose value of what you've grown. So you distill some of it. And as Jordan said, it's a commodity that can be traded for many other goods. And so Washington actually owned 2 stills as early as 1759, 1760. And so they had orchards. They're making brandy, I bet, in the 1760s, long before he thought about commercial distilling. So I think through each colony, it's going to vary a bit. But as Jordan told me in one of our conversations long ago, as he was doing his research, those coastal cities where that raw material is coming in, that's where you see this huge rum distillation. And then it changes as you get west and you move toward Pittsburgh or Western Virginia, things start to get smaller and different. In fact, Patrick Henry owned a 3-still distillery in the 1790s in Southwest Virginia. So it's just woven through the fabric of the country. And it's partly because people like to drink. It's also commodity. And it's also thought of as curing and medicinal in many social cases. So that's that story that all parts of our society imbibed in that.
Yeah. I don't know if Jordan or Steve know enough about this to or want to add on this, but like one of the things that I thought about when we started to talk about doing this episode was the Whiskey Rebellion. And specifically, you guys mentioned that whiskey became really a big thing in the 1790s. Well, the Whiskey Rebellion basically is a response to people who don't know, is a response to a tax, right, on whiskey. And that's because during the American War of Independence, rum consumption is disrupted, right? I hope I'm correct, Jordan, at least for a little bit, because most of the rum, I'm assuming, comes to the Caribbean. And because rum consumption is disrupted and beer is like easier to spill and all this type of stuff, whiskey consumption increases. And then in 1791, the United States government decides to put a tax on whiskey, and then there's like a huge rebellion and like from preventing these tax collectors in Pennsylvanian counties from collecting the tax. Of course, it's Pennsylvania, because where else would it be? So I guess my question was, when it comes to eventually the consumption of rum and whiskey in the American Republic after 1787, do not just enslaved people, but do white people during the era recognize the immense commercial as well as cultural impact of these two spirits in their lives?
So I'll start to take a stab at it, and then somebody can bail me out when I find myself stuck. So the first thing I would just kind of say is that I think the demise of rum in the American Revolution is greatly exaggerated. And so it's not that rum like ceases to exist as a commodity, but again, the best numbers that I've been able to find are in 1770, Americans are producing about 4.8 million gallons of rum. And then around 1790, they're still producing 4.2 million gallons of rum. Now, of course, those are decades where the American population is growing exceedingly quickly. And so, making up that difference is increasingly whiskey made of rye and increasingly corn and fruit brandies as well. But so these two commodities did kind of coexist for a while. Increasingly, I think that the rum was part of kind of this explosion in the transatlantic slave trade in the decade or two before it ceased to exist legally in the United States. And so that also helps us understand the Whiskey Rebellion a little bit differently, because the tax was on distillates. It wasn't just on whiskey. And so there were I've gone through kind of customs house records and other records where people are very concerned about what this is doing to the rum industry as well. And so I think the difference is that the way in which if I remember correctly, and it's been a long time since I did comps, if I remember correctly, the taxes often were kind of exacted based on kind of whether you were running a distillery or not, there were ways to pay kind of a flat fee rather than having to pay for every gallon you were producing. So these big rum distilleries had some advantage according to Western farmers. Western farmers probably also thought, and I don't know this for sure, they also thought George Washington was getting off easy because his distillery too was a really big distillery comparatively. So, but yeah, so that I'm going to stop there because that's about all I know about the Whiskey Rebellion.
No, but that's so interesting to remember. Yeah, Steve, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, that's very interesting to know about the rum, because that's, I think that needs to be brought up, that it was all spirits. I didn't really even realize that. I would say that the Washington distillery and the Whiskey Rebellion separated by about 3 or 4 years. So when the rebellion happens, he doesn't even have a distillery. He doesn't even know that he'd ever have one. But I do know that, having given talks in Western PA, they're still not happy about the Whiskey Rebellion. And they're also not happy that Washington was an absentee landlord in Southwest Pennsylvania. But the thing about the rebellion, when I talk about it, there's kind of 2 ways to look at it. From the Washington perspective, the country as a macro view, that he had to pay for the war debt and the collected debt of the states. So, but what Jordan said is right. The big distillers could avoid levels of the tax by just producing more gallons. So for the small guy in Western PA, the way the tax was written originally, you had to pay your tax in cash. And on the frontier, you don't have a lot of cash. And there's one story where a farmer with a still was handed a bill while he's harvesting crops and told, you have to go to Philadelphia to court and you live near Pittsburgh, there was a lot of things done that you can understand the anger of the small farmer or the guy who distilled 100 gallons for 4 weeks, at a time. So I think that's also a story that seems to run through distilling over the ages, is this battle between the small entrepreneurial or the small farmer versus the big farmers. So, and the rebellion also took place in Western Virginia, Western North Carolina, but Pittsburgh was the heart of it, outside Pittsburgh, and where the mob really did a lot of damage. But it's interesting to see, as I've studied spirits, is these themes, and I guess it's studying human history, themes keep cropping up. And we're right now facing, the FET tax going up. If they don't pass something for craft distillers, it's going to hurt a lot of people. So it's very curious to me, these things keep repeating themselves.
Yeah. Based on that, there's a really good question in the Q&A. Sorry, Tracy, go ahead.
So go ahead. No, go ahead. Well, my question, the thing that I realized, the actual outrage didn't necessarily come from the Whiskey Rebellion. It came from Washington's response, right? Because it was the fact that they were like 500 people, and he came in with 15,000 armed troops. And that was what was outrageous to everyone.
No, actually, it was the tax. It was that's where the first, they tarred and feathered people. Places were burned. And what Washington was concerned about is a lot of the rebels were gathering. There was one, the Mingo Creek group, there's 5,000 people gathered, and they were talking about linking up with the British and the French and shipping goods down the Mississippi, which really couldn't have been done because the Spanish still controlled it, but they were looking west and not looking about being part of the country. And for Washington, in his first term, he couldn't have a war on the frontier. And that was his concern as a president. But he did send the biggest army out there that he could. In fact, more troops than he ever led in the field during the Revolution that he led out there. And he didn't go all the way to the final destination, but the governor of Virginia, a man named Henry Lee III, Light Horse Harry Lee, he led those troops. And it's interesting that that is Robert E. Lee's father. Oh. So it's interesting, the connections that happen through history.
Small world, man. Matt, you have a question from the Q&A.
Yeah, the history of distilling is the history of America. Stepping on the small man to benefit the rich since its foundation. Yay. Exploiting Black people since its foundation. Yay. So I think we do need to get to the Q&As because we have some really amazing questions that I'd like to do that from our audience's members, and we always move into the second half as my wife calls it. This is the second half of the program is not drinking with historians, it's drunk with historians, because we have continued to be drinking. But I actually have a question for Tracy, because a bunch of people have been asking, very understandably, since we are drinking this delicious Uncle Nearest 1856. What's the deal with Uncle Nearest? What is the story of Nearest Green? So can you tell us a little bit about that, Tracy?
Yes, absolutely. Happy to. I am really excited to be able to present Uncle Nearest, this brand, this whiskey to all of you. So this all begins basically back in 2016. The New York Times released an article that said Jack Daniels embraces a secret ingredient. And they had a picture of Jack Daniels sitting next to a Black man and all of his distillery workers. Now, the issue was Jack Daniels wasn't centered. He actually had centered this Black man in that picture. That article was released. Fawn Weaver happened to see that article and go, I want to figure out who that Black man is in that picture. So she starts to do some research, and the article, they thought that was, they knew that it was a slave. They didn't know exactly who it was, and they thought that was Nathan Green. Nathan Green had been mentioned in Jack Daniels' biography, so they assumed that must be him. Now, as Fawn did her research, she realized that was actually his son. And who is Nathan Green, though, right? Who is Nathan Nearest Green? Nathan Nearest Green worked at a farm called the Dan Call Farm. Jack Daniels, when he was young, about 7, 8 years old, he ran away from home and went to work at the Dan Call Farm. While he was working there, he worked actually down at the store. There was also a farm. He had a church. So Dan Call was a preacher. And up on the hill, there was the still. That was like the magical place where Jack Daniels wasn't able to go because he was a child. Now, he kept pressuring Dan Call, saying he wanted to learn how to make whiskey. So eventually, as he got older, he took Jack Daniels up the hill and introduced him to Nathan Nearest Green. He introduced him as the best distiller that he knew, and told Nathan to teach Jack Daniels everything that he knew about distilling. So that is what happened. And we know that happened around 1856. So that is where this bottle actually is honoring the fact that Nathan Nearest Green taught Jack Daniels to make Tennessee whiskey. So we all know bourbon, right? And the rules of bourbon: 51% corn, can't distill over 160, in the bottle 125, made in America, blah, 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 blah. So this is basically bourbon in there. We do the exact same things for Tennessee whiskey, but there's an additional process called the Lincoln County process. And Nathan Nearest Green actually was in Lincoln County when he taught Jack Daniels this process. What they do is they take sugar maple and they burn it down into charcoal. They will stack it, put it into a big bucket or a tank or whatever it may be, and they run the new make spirit through that charcoal. What that's doing is pulling out some congeners, it's pulling out fusel oils, and it's kind of giving a kickstart to your maturation process. So you do that, and then you put it into your barrel. That is what happens with Tennessee whiskey. So whenever you see that on a bottle, that's what's happening. That is a technique that Nathan Nearest Green taught Jack Daniels, right? So Jack Daniels was working at that. They ended up working together at the still. Nathan Nearest Green stays at the farm through Civil War. Once he gets his freedom, Jack Daniels actually takes over the distillery because Dan Call, again, was a preacher. His wife and his church said, no, you can't have whiskey and run a church. Like, we think that this is wrong. So he actually let go of the distillery, but he let that go to Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels actually, as soon as he created his own distillery, the first person that he hired was Nathan Nearest Green. So he was the first master distiller at Jack Daniels, not number two. Nathan Nearest Green was the first distiller. So what that's actually done, so Fawn Weaver, as she did all of this research and really discovered this story, she realized that, and one of the only reasons that she's able to know all of this is because Jack Daniels made sure that nobody could be able to forget Nathan Nearest Green. His name was written everywhere. He was talked about. The family knew about him. The Green family was actually one of the most wealthy families in the city, wealthier than a lot of white people, because he was paid a fair wage. And his family also worked at the distillery. And his family has worked, the Green ancestry has been at the distillery since it's opened, and there are still 3 people working there today. So that is the story of Uncle Nearest. So uncle would have been a term of respect. You wouldn't have called him sir because he was a black man, an enslaved black man. And so Uncle Nearest is what we call the brand. And it's the 1856 is a blend of whiskeys, 9 to 12 years old. It is distilled through the Tennessee County process, the Lincoln County process, to make it Tennessee whiskey. And then after that, we also filter it through coconut carbon and diatomaceous earth to really kind of pull off any rough edges on that. And that is what we're drinking today. I hope I got everything in. I know it's a long story.
I just wanted to add that it's delicious. And the one thing I wanted to add is this story, right? So if you are teaching the story to your students, to anybody watching, the reason this is an amazing story to teach is I just taught this amazing book. I taught, where's the book? The book is here somewhere. It's called They Were Her Property by Stephanie Jones Rogers. Basically, it talks about white women who own enslaved people, right? And I asked my students, what are the stakes of that book? So what the stakes are of the fact that people were able to discover that, Uncle Nearest Green was the first master distiller, is that you're able to prove that slavery was a national enterprise, right? It pervaded all of American history. And if you're able to prove that, you're able to really show that if not for slavery, the status of American society in the 19th century and then the 20th century and now the 21st century would not be where it was today, right? And so that's why I think it's amazing that Jack Daniels did this work and is recognizing this, because that's what it shows, right? It shows that if not for enslaved people, you would not have whiskey as you have it today. You would not have rum as you have it today. So that's basically that was my point. But there was a really interesting question in the Q&A that I wanted to ask Jordan and Steve if they are aware of it. A lot of students, when they take U.S. history survey, they get to the point of the 19th century where everyone is obsessed with temperance. So I guess my question is, was there a worry about alcoholism when it comes to rum and whiskey in the 19th century, specifically late 18th century and late 19th century?
There was. So it was, I think, again, this is like that one footnote in the dissertation that hasn't been revisited in a long time. So there was I think like the idea of like a drinking man's disease was kind of a latter half of the 18th century kind of invention in some ways. And so some of those ideas existed. And then of course, one of the most famous early American doctors, Benjamin Rush, created that famous moral thermometer, which is another thing like worth looking at. where he ranked kind of different alcohols as more healthful and less healthful. And was generally trying to encourage Americans to drink fewer distilled spirits. So there were questions about kind of overconsumption, but they were less, I think like what we really think of as temperance was more of a 19th century, like kind of built over the course of the 19th century.
So I just wanted to ask, there's another question. You, Tracy and Steve, you told us a lot about Mount Vernon and Uncle Nearest. Has the mash bill, so the mash bill, for people who don't know, is like the type of, like, not the recipe, but like basically the stuff that goes in it, the grains that go in it, has that changed a lot since since Uncle Nearest was alive and since the original distillery was open? Or what changes have you really made? I guess we can go to Tracy first.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's going to be essential no matter what is you're going to have that malted barley. You need those enzymes. So that is an incredibly critical component that you're going to have. So that's going to always be part of your whiskey. And I think really what was happening, again, this was an agricultural product. So your mash bill was based on where you lived and what products you had left over. They weren't necessarily looking for consistency all the time. They were using what was around, and they wanted to make sure, like, if they had extra corn, all of that corn, instead of going and rotting, was going to be used and made into whiskey. So mash bills might have changed slightly even within some of those distilleries, but we know that there would have always, Steve will talk, I'm sure, in more detail, that there would always be that malted barley, because that's going to give you those additional enzymes to make sure that everything is malted through. But also, if barley wasn't easily accessible, they could have malted their corn or malted their rye. That is a possibility as well. There's Steve, you want to pop in? I'm sure that you have great insight on that.
I guess before Steve answers, is there a reason there's a law about what's bourbon and what's rye? I guess that's sort of the root of the question. Yeah.
Those codifications come later.
Yeah.
So and even some of the bourbon rules were written in 1964. So the 18th century, it's like Tracy said, you're a farmer, even if you're a good sized farmer like Washington, you're going to utilize what's on hand and distill that. And down at the tavern, what they want is whiskey or rum. They're not thinking, oh, gee, this wasn't as great as the last batch that we had Tuesday. And even at Mount Vernon, I found a record in 1797 when they were first distilling in the cooperage before they built the big building, that Anderson writes Washington and says, we don't have any rye, so I'm using wheat tailings and corn from the mill. Whereas the main mash bill was a rye mash bill. But again, you have to adjust. And so, and I think that probably happened throughout other countries too, And then in the 19th century, with the development of brands and that recognition of brands of the early big distilleries, you start to see them honing in on their flavor profiles. But on the market, I'm sure so many barrels of whiskey went between different hands, different cities. People didn't think, oh, that's from such and such distillery. It was simply that it was whiskey, and hopefully it was good. Sometimes it had to be mixed with other things in order to mask things that needed to be masked. And a lot of people talk about the development of punches, in particular in the 18th century, that took the edge off certain alcohols to make them more palatable. And so I think, in a way, there's a lot of alchemy going on over the centuries with distilled spirits.
One thing
is that the same story with rum? Like, is there only later does the consistency of rum come about?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I think there was a lot of experimenting and making do, and so. Kind of guides to distillation, both in kind of manuscript form, but I mean, you could go on Google Books and you can find these guides to distilling from the 18th century, and they're really interesting to read sometimes. But there are always kind of backup plans, so to speak, and that's a huge part of it. One thing I wanted to kind of just mention, this is something I was thinking about earlier today, is that, again, when we think about distilling kind of worldwide and kind of what makes kind of like where we can see kind of American innovations. One thing I was thinking a lot about, which I hadn't really thought much about before, is corn, of course, is a New World crop, right? So when we're talking about these whiskeys made from corn in part or all, that's really interesting because then you have to also think about indigenous knowledge and kind of chicha or pozol, like Latin American kind of beers made of corn as well. And I also, I was kind of looking at my research notes and I was like, do I have anything cool for like whiskey? And so the earliest reference I've been able to find for corn-based spirits comes from 1765. And this is where you're gonna see, I'm a huge Philadelphia sports fan as well. It comes from Philadelphia and the Gratzes. And the language used, and so this is all complicated because of course, British people will call grains corn sometimes. But this reference in particular, I wrote down the quote. Distill it, a sort of English brandy from corn. So 1765. So again, this is the Gratz family, kind of famous merchants involved in the Indian trade in Pennsylvania. But one of the other things that's interesting, and again, this is just more of a thought exercise than anything definitive, but several Gratz of the sons of the Gratz brothers go to Kentucky, right? And the entire family also owns, or many people in the family own slaves. We are, like, I think this is something else where the ingredients might tell us a story, and it might not be definitive, but it's still, I think it's still interesting. So I had forgotten about that story and I wanted to share that because I saw it earlier today.
That is perhaps the most Philly thing ever, is to say it's really Philly. Yeah, Kentucky bourbon is not, it's really Philadelphia. So thank you for that. A couple of questions that have been popping up in the Q&A, and also just kind of you guys have kind of touched on is like, how does moonshine play into this? Because I think the common conception of moonshine is basically what you guys are describing, is like you take some grain and you throw it in a still in your backyard, and you kind of make some liquor out of it. And then kind of related to something, Steve, that you mentioned, I'd love to hear more about, is that like in the late 18th century, maybe the early 19th century, is like the transportation of this liquor, like, is it just being made locally, or is it actually moving? And I guess that gets into kind of questions about, like, Jordan, you mentioned at the very beginning, kind of the triangle trade. Is stuff still coming into from the Caribbean? Is Scotch coming in, across the Atlantic and stuff like that? So I know that that's a lot. So maybe like the moonshine question, and then the trade question, if we don't mind. So.
Well, moonshine, we get asked a lot about as people are touring the distillery, because when you say it's unaged whiskey, the first thing tourists will say is, oh, it's moonshine. And I say, no, it's a rye whiskey. Moonshiners often don't have thousands of pounds of grain in the middle of the woods to make their product out of. So they will often get sugar, the raw sugar. And this is more 19th, 20th century, but a farmer's going to have grain. But that's, I think, the difference I always point out is a moonshiner might flavor with some grains or sometimes some fruits, but he's not going to be hauling wagon loads to hide from the revenue or in the middle of the woods to make whiskey. So the other early reference to moonshine that I have found is out of Scotland. And with the heavy taxation that happened on Scottish spirits by the British Parliament, there were times where they were just crushing the distilleries. And so I found a Scottish reference that they would distill at night by the light of the moon, and they called it moonshine. So I think that term deserves some more research, I think, because that's quite interesting. Regarding movement of spirits across borders, from what I've read about whiskey, and Jordan can correct me if he's found other things, but I know Mount Vernon only had one shipment that went to Richmond. The rest of it went to Alexandria, 9 miles down the road. And it seems to me that most of it was a very localized regional market as opposed to shipping overseas. Now, I did find in the early 19th century, there's some listings for American grain spirits going overseas, but I don't have the raw data on that. These were just larger reports from the government listings. But maybe, Jordan, you want to add something there?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Steve's point, these whiskey distilleries, even George Washington's, which was one of the bigger ones in the late 1790s, it was 5 stills, but Steve, how large was the largest still?
He had 2 135-gallon stills.
Yeah, so those are still kind of comparatively relatively small stills. So I think there was generally, and this was something that went back further in the 18th century, Virginians were importing alcohol rather than exporting it. There was not enough of a kind of distilling industry to meet their demands. And so again, a lot of the rum was sometimes coming from Philadelphia, Baltimore, even though Baltimore didn't have that many distilleries south. So rum, again, because these distilleries were a lot bigger, there was kind of more of a circulation of the finished product. Again, one thing that we want to keep in mind is a lot of these alcohols were not being aged, so they were going to be clear, and the only age they were getting was as they went to market. But and I think this is where, again, Steve mentioned coopers, and they were so important for this process, and because you needed a good barrel to get things to market. And this is another place where kind of enslaved expertise was hugely important. So in my ongoing book project, I track a distiller named Quaco, a cooper named Quaco, who was trained in Barbados, ends up getting sold seemingly against his will to Boston, where he's hired by a distiller, and then the distiller finds out he can't really make the types of barrels he needs. And so it creates this legal record that I'm able to follow. And so the rum would be sent elsewhere, sometimes in very large barrels, but very large barrels might be too heavy to move. And so then you needed smaller barrels. So there are also kind of stories of a distiller or a cooper named Kwashi, who worked for the Royal African Company, but was sent to London, where he apprenticed with a cooper and then ultimately ran away. And in the runaway ads, they suggested, well, if you come, give yourself up, we'll send you back to kind of West Africa. And so these, they're like, again, kind of the circulation of rum becomes hugely important in a very kind of complicated process that a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about.
Okay. So I wanted to,
if I could make
go ahead.
one comment that Jordan prompted me on a memory, that there's a book about slaves working in the industry that came out many years ago. And one of the things you see that happens is, and this referred to an enslaved man that worked at an iron furnace, and he learned to make pig iron very well. And so when it got hot in Virginia in the summer, he left the furnace and he had a girlfriend on another property, but the owner of that furnace didn't send people to go get him. He wrote a friend and complained about it. He's gone away, but the cool weather came, the enslaved man came back, made the iron, and other slaves that worked at the furnace said, how come he's treated differently than I'm treated? He had a valuable skill. He had a trade, and I've seen that in other instances where, it's sad to say, but if you're working in the field versus somebody that can run a still or cooper, there's going to be different treatment applied. And with that one particular furnace, that enslaved man was the key iron maker. And he ended up, they also found in that research that he had an account at the local store. And you're like, how does he have an account? Well, he was paid for excess pig iron that he made. So guess what? He made as much as he could. So he bought himself out of slavery eventually through that process. So I think that that's a part of industry and study of enslaved people that, I'm sure others are working on it, but I found that really interesting when I first heard that story.
Yeah. So the last question I have is for Tracy, just because we've been talking about Uncle Nearest and whiskey a lot. What does the world of whiskey distillation look like today? Not just the distillation, but like, how famous is American whiskey and Tennessee whiskey? Because, for example, a couple of years ago, I wanted to buy a bottle of Blanton's, and it was like $60, and I bought it. Recently, I wanted to buy a bottle of Blanton's. It's a bourbon for people who don't know, and it was $120.
Oh.
So I guess my question is, why is it that I had to save up for 2 years to buy this bottle of Elmer T. Lee? And another related question is, why isn't American whiskey so famous right now? Like, what is the deal with bourbon and Tennessee whiskey? Why do people love it?
Well, some of that is regional, right? So you happen to be in an area where everybody knows what brands are sought after in other areas. So they can mark those prices up because they know you'll pay for them, because if you lived somewhere that had wasn't quite as populated, you might be able to actually find that Elmer T. Lee, which I was on a conversation last night, having a conversation with a gentleman who's like, oh yeah, it's at my local store. And I was like, what? Right? We had just talked about
Send me a bottle.
Right. So, yes, Tennessee whiskey. Jack Daniel's is a Tennessee whiskey. That is, and it is the #1 selling whiskey in the world. So so if we're talking about, is American whiskey popular, it is. And part of that's because if we think of all of the things that have been exported out of the United States, our culture is what's been exported, and our whiskeys is part of our culture. That bourbon is a sign of our culture, it's our tradition, it's our heritage. That's also going to be transported and exported outside of our country as a piece of America. And I think right now, America is popular. You know what I mean? The things of like hip hop is popular, and a lot of the things that are popular that we try to show to the world are being accepted and being sought after. So I feel like that's also part of the reason for the rise. It's also delicious.
I've had two drafts and it's so good.
Yes, I think that we have it's very different from Scotch whiskey, which has been, the #1 whiskey for so long. And while I love Scotch whiskey, as we can see from some of those things up there, there's a different palate that comes when you're talking about bourbons and Tennessee whiskey. And American whiskey itself tends to be a bit more bold. There tends to be a little bit of sweetness on it. That is just a different type of whiskey that is popular, especially in places that maybe didn't have it in the same numbers that we have now, especially with all of the new craft distilleries and other distilleries that are opening. We have a large, diverse group of flavors that are available now. Steve, if you'd like to step in and chat about this, I'd love to have you on as well. Oh, no. Sorry.
I think the other aspect would be the cocktail culture resurgence that's happened over the last decade or more. And American spirits lend themselves to cocktails much better than Scotch. Yes. I've traveled in Southeast Asia and did some whiskey events for the Distilled Spirits Council. And you see all the Scotch, and you'll see Jack Daniels and Jim Beam, but introducing other American brands to that part of the world. And the younger people in India as well, they want the cocktails. So I think but as I think all of us here, we like to drink it neat or in the summertime with a little ice if you're a whiskey person like us, but like Jordan's enjoying his cocktail this evening. So I think that's one other aspect that really just adds to it.
Yeah. I love a good cocktail. Are you kidding me? I love a good whiskey cocktail. And that is actually the plan for one of these. We're going to do cocktails.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, somebody asked a question before Matt wraps up. Somebody asked a question, how I got into whiskey, and it was because of a bet. So let me just explain the bet really quickly. So I was in this club called Model UN back in college. And when I was in this club, I didn't compete for the first 3 years. Finally, senior year, I decided to compete, where you go to conferences across at other colleges. And one of my friends who had competed his whole life from undergrad and in high school and in middle school, he was like, after my first conference, when I didn't win, he was like, I bet you can't win, 3 conferences in a row. And I was like, man, I will give you 3 first place wins. I ended the semester with 5 first place wins. And at the beginning of the semester, he said, I'll give you a bottle of Blue Label. I just agreed to the bet, not knowing what Blue Label was. I had no idea what I was betting. I assumed I was going to be giving him like $50 or something. Turns out Blue Label is like really decent blended whiskey. And so when I get this bottle, I asked my friend, who's just, given me this bottle because he's lost, what do I do with this? Can I drink this with some Coke or maybe some ice? He's like, no. And in the process of finishing this bottle, I was convinced that Scotch whiskey is where it's at. And that's basically what happened. So if people want to know, that's how I got into whiskey. But I was telling Tracy earlier, if you want to get into whiskey, the best way to do it is to find like a cheap whiskey that you enjoy, neat or with ice. Mix it with a little Coke, and then less and less Coke every day, or your soda of choice. It's really easy to get into whiskey. But now I will let Matt wrap up because
a certain whiskey.
I've had like 2 glasses of this and I can't stop. It's a problem.
Well, you're in good company because you got into whiskey via Scotland, and George Washington got into whiskey via a Scottish farm manager. So you're in good company.
Yeah. At some point, I want to do an episode. I want to bring on a historian of Japan who's aware of this, but how Japan got in Japanese whiskey, because Japanese whiskey is amazing.
And
we can talk about that one day.
And Taiwan too.
Yeah. Also, I don't have a bottle of it with me, but Indian whiskey. There's a bottle called Amrit, which is solid. There's also a bottle from France called Bastille. Amazing. Basically, if anybody, once this pandemic is over, find a whiskey bar and just find random whiskeys to drink. It's a great way to spend your night.
And Matt, I would just like to say, I was periodically looking at the questions. There's a lot of good ones. If there's any way at another time we can answer some of those for folks, because there were a lot of great questions we couldn't get to, I think all of us would be more than happy to do so.
Is there one that you want to answer right now?
Well, there was just one about, can the archaeology be accessed at Mount Vernon? And I would say yes, through the mountvernon.org website. You can go to the distillery page or the library page, and there's even there's the whole reports on the excavation of the house for families, the distillery. So I would say go to our website, but there are artifacts that are on display at Mount Vernon from those digs. But I just, occasionally would look at the questions, a lot of great questions there.
Yeah, I would also say that if anybody wants to email me, I do try to kind of respond to emails that I get if you have specific questions. I saw one about African antecedents to rum, and I think that's a really interesting question. And I'll tease the book that's not that close to being out yet, but I think it is interesting, and I think there are, like, the palm wine industry in West Africa in particular is interesting. There wasn't, to what I've been able to find, there wasn't distilling in kind of the Western style that kind of defines rum and eventually whiskey. So that would be one difference. But I think even in some of the ways in which I think for palm wine, you normally aren't adding much to get it to ferment. That's more similar than sometimes for whiskey, especially in like fairly temperate climates, you're adding yeast and you're adding other things sometimes to get it to ferment. So, but again, there's a lot more there. I wish I had a book to try to sell you all, but it's probably
eventually
2 or 3 years
it'll be out.
Well, we'll just, Jordan, you'll have to come back. Like that'll be it, and then we'll just have a rum themed episode, and you'll just tell us about rums, and we'll just drink rum until we're all happy or as tipsy as we are right now. So
yeah, I have to let you know,
that's fun.
I don't like rums except in dark and stormy, so you'll have to convince me that rum is good.
Oh, but the thing with rum, and I know we've got kind of somebody in the whiskey industry, or 2 people in the whiskey industry on this call, but you can get really rums that have been aged for a really long time and have premium ingredients, and they're a fraction of the cost of whiskey. So if you look at some of the like top shelves when you go to the liquor store, you'll find some really interesting stuff, and it'll turn you on to rum, I would say.
I guess I'm a rum fan now.
It sounds like you have to do a bet with her, Jordan.
I mean, if we've learned anything, right? It's not like Varsha will bet anything. She doesn't know what she's betting on, right? She'll just do a bet.
It's true. This is why I've never gambled at Las Vegas, because I will.
Well, Jordan helped make this George Washington rum right here.
Wait, Mount Vernon makes rum too?
We did it once. We'll do it again. Yeah, but yeah, Jordan was in on that big time.
And my bottle is behind this pile of books, but this looks more official for teaching.
All right, like we're gonna have to at some point do this again because we have a million amazing questions. We have to learn about Jordan's rum that he made at Mount Vernon, and we didn't even talk about Tracy's Broadway career. So I mean, like we got to come back to that. So, but we do have to wrap up because honestly, my liver can't take any more of this, and I need to take a break. But thank you so much, Steve and Jordan and Tracy, for joining us. I am delighted. I think Varsha and I speak for Varsha. Like we should do this again. This was so much fun.
This was amazing.
I'd love to reconvene because there's a lot more to talk about, and
there's absolutely so much.
And I really enjoyed seeing everybody. And Jordan, great to see you again.
Yes.
Yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to Steve, Jordan, and Tracy for joining us. Thank you to Uncle Nearest for partnering with us on this event. This lovely 1856 Uncle Nearest Tennessee whiskey is phenomenal whiskey, and you should all go out and buy a bottle right now. But for now. But for right now, thank you, everyone. And let me close by simply saying to everybody, have a great Friday, have a great weekend, and cheers.
Cheers.